I'm David Tunick, president of the IFPDA, and it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to the third day of IFPDA Print Month. Today's presentation is called Aquatint, From Its Origins to Goya, with Rena Hoisington. It is well for us to remember that old master prints were once cutting-edge contemporary. The discovery and implementation of Aquatint was high-tech in its time. While some say that Aquatint first appeared in Germany in the 16th century, it's generally accepted that it was invented in the mid-17th century by the Dutch and reinvented about 100 years later in France, then in England, and once more in Germany. The discovery and rediscoveries of the medium of Aquatint was major news in its day. We must remind ourselves that prints as multiples, etchings, woodcuts, engravings, were the principal means before photography of disseminating and circulating images. Prints were also, of course, a principal medium for certain artists called peintre-graveur, painter-engravers, who added printmaking to their own creative arsenals. Durer and Rembrandt, for example, made prints, yes, for dissemination, but stood proud on their own as works of art. Think of Night, Death, and the Devil, or the Three Crosses. Then along comes Aquatint, a real game changer that finally, after centuries of printmaking, provides artists with a way of replicating wash drawings. Goya, as you will hear from our speaker today, was certainly the greatest artist who ever lived, who used Aquatint to unsurpassing achievement until perhaps Picasso. Rena Hoisington will tell you that story in far more detail. A word about Rena: she's the very distinguished head of Old Master and 19th century prints at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, before which she served for more than a decade as head of prints, drawings, and photographs at the Baltimore Museum. There and in earlier curatorial positions at the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford and at the Philadelphia Museum, she produced exhibitions ranging from European paintings of the 15th century, French prints in the 18th century, to exhibitions of Rodin sculpture, Vienna secession posters, and Mexican modernist prints. She has published, taught, and lectured widely, and I don't mind saying, worked for an art dealer, Wildenstein, in her early formative years as a leading expert in our field. This year, she won the highly coveted IFPDA Book Prize for her scholarly, extraordinary, and groundbreaking book entitled Aquatint: From Its Origins to Goya, for the exhibition of the same name that was at the National Gallery from October 2021 to February 2022. Some logistics before we get started, before Rena takes over the screen. There will be a Q&A at the end if time allows. We have a few hundred people calling in. Click on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, not the chat. If you have any questions, put them in there throughout the program. We may not get to all the questions, but we're going to try. With that, I'm now pleased to turn this program over to my friend, Rena Hoisington, who I'm certain will enlighten us today. Thank you, Rena. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, David, for that incredibly thoughtful introduction. Thank you, too, to Jenny Gibbs, the Executive Director of the IFPDA Foundation, for asking me to give this presentation. And thanks to Sherry Young for calmly and patiently handling all of the logistics. It is my great pleasure to give a virtual overview today on the book Aquatint: From Its Origins to Goya and the related exhibition of the same title that was on view at the National Gallery of Art. You can see the sign here outside the West Building from October 24th, 2021 to February 21st, 2022. I am honored and truly humbled to receive the IFPDA Foundation Book Award for our Aquatint book, and especially when I consider the list of extraordinary publications that have received this award in years past. Producing books and organizing exhibitions are complicated, time-consuming, and collaborative endeavors. And this project came to fruition during a pandemic. I easily could spend the next hour thanking all of the many people who helped bring the Aquatint book and the Aquatint exhibition about, but being mindful of time, I will have to keep it short. First, I would like to I'm grateful to the IFPDA Foundation for this award. Second, I acknowledge and give thanks to the Eugene V. and Claire E. Thaw Charitable Trust for generously funding the book and the exhibition alike, and to Princeton University Press for co-publishing the book with the National Gallery of Art. Third, I am grateful to many, many colleagues, first and foremost at the National Gallery, but also in the larger print world. Fourth, I greatly appreciate the support of my family who had to live with me while I was working on this project. And last but not least, I thank you all for listening to my talk today. So, the spark of the idea for this project, that is on the development of the tonal intaglio printmaking technique of Aquatint in the second half of the 18th century in Europe, goes back to the spring of 2018, not long before I started working at the National Gallery of Art, when Jonathan Bober, the Andrew W. Mellon Senior Curator of Prints and Drawings, acquired a group of nearly 50 early Aquatints, mostly French, works made between the 1760s and the 1780s. And here I'm showing you a shot of our e-study room with works by François-Philippe Charpentier spread out on the table and the shelves behind. The topic of Aquatint is one that I've been interested in for many years, and especially following my research on the Aquatints of Jean-Baptiste Le Prince and Louis-Jean Després for the 2013-2014 exhibition Artists and Amateurs at in 18th Century France at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I was fortunate to work on this material with Perrin Stein, Elizabeth Rudy, and Charlotte Guichard. And thanks to Perrin Stein for these two beautiful installation shots of the show, the opening, and the gallery here that showed works by Després and Le Prince on these beautiful aubergine walls. Now, the Aquatint project provided a welcome opportunity to dive into and start familiarizing myself with the National Gallery's graphic collections, which number more than 110,000 objects. I was very pleased to discover early on how many early Aquatints we already had in the collection, extending back to two gifts from what we consider our foundational donors. So up here at left, we have from the Widener collection, which came in 1942, the Tumble by François-Philippe Charpentier after Jean-Honoré Fragonard, where we see a frolicking amorous couple who've knocked over the easel of an artist working in a rustic interior. At center, you can see from Lessing J. Rosenwald, who began giving his extraordinary collection to the National Gallery in 1943, including complete first edition albums of Goya's Los Caprichos and The Disasters of War. And here I am showing you plate 32 from the Caprichos, published in 1799, the title Because She Was Susceptible. There are also key acquisitions that the National Gallery made over the years, such as our acquisition of the Marc J. Millard Architectural Collection in 1985. And here at lower right, I'm showing you plate 23 from George Richardson's 1781 publication entitled A New Collection of Chimney Pieces Ornamented to the Style of the Etruscan, Greek, and Roman Architecture, containing 36 designs suitable to the most elegant range of apartments. Now, Aquatint from its origins to Goya is not a comprehensive overview of the subject, but rather a narrative that is built on and told from the perspective of the National Gallery's collections, which are very strong, but there are gaps. For example, we don't have a great assortment of British topographical and travel books. And here I would point you to Douglas Fordham's 2019 publication, Aquatint Worlds, Travel, Print, and Empire. In this study, Fordham discusses how the production, proliferation, and consumption of aquatinted views of different countries and cultures at the turn of the 19th century are inseparable from larger historical currents of European colonialism and global hegemony. And of course, I want to acknowledge 4 important standard sources to consult on the early history of Aquatint. First at left is Margaret Morgan Griselli's 2003 exhibition catalog, Colorful Impressions, The Printmaking Revolution in 18th Century France, which was held here at the National Gallery of Art. Second is the volume that accompanied Christiana Wiebel's landmark 2007 exhibition on early aquatints that drew on the historic collections of the Vesta Coburg in Germany. Third is Ad Steinman's 2012 indispensable publication, Engraving and Etching, 1400 to 2000, a history of the development of manual intaglio printmaking processes. And certainly Anthony Griffith's invaluable 2016 publication, The Print Before Photography, an introduction to European printmaking, 1550 to 1820, to say nothing of Anthony's 1987 Print Quarterly article, Notes on Early Aquatint in England and France. So before we get any further, what is aquatint? In its most basic form, the aquatint process involves distributing a pulverized rosin, so pitch or tree sap, across a copper plate and fusing it to the plate with heat. The plate is then submerged in an acid bath where the acid eats away at or bites the exposed areas of copper around and between the rosin particles. The human eye reads the resulting speckled pattern of acid-bitten indentations when inked and printed on paper as tone. The appearance of aquatint varies depending on the size of the rosin particles, how long they've been applied to the plate's surface, and on how long and how often the plate has been corroded by acid, among other factors. And here I am showing you a detail, some rosin on the plate, and here I'm showing you a detail from upper left of the Roman view painter Carlo Labruzzi's charming etching and aquatint of two women from 1788. And as you can see, the longer the plate spends in the acid bath, the more the acid eats around the rosin particles and into the plate, the deeper indentations holding more ink and printing darker tone. And here we have 1, 2, 3, 4 tones. Now, bearing in mind that many people, even art historians, are not necessarily familiar with the technique, it was essential to have a materials and techniques case, or process case, as we called it, to help our visitors better understand and appreciate the process. And we had to fight long and hard to get this in the show, but I'm so glad we could have it in the third gallery of the exhibition. And I loved that it was complemented here. We had photo blow-ups of several aquatints in the show. This is a photo blow-up of Maria Katharina Prestel's aquatint landscape with two trees after Hermann Softleben. And it was a wonderful opportunity to show that distinctive speckled pattern of aquatint, and also a nice parallel to all the lush details that we had in the show. The creation of the works in this case, and again, you can see we recreated through steps that detail of that Labruzzi print, were the results of collaboration with my colleague Michelle Ficini, paper conservator, who you can see at right at the National Gallery, and True Ludwig, who you can see at left, Baltimore printmaker and longtime faculty member at the Maryland College Institute of Art. Although there was much in the way of travel and research that I simply couldn't undertake for this project because of the pandemic, the time spent aquatinting with True and Michelle in True's Purple Crayon studio here in Baltimore were invaluable in terms of helping me think through this project. All right. So we have on the left the book cover again, and on right, that's the entrance to the exhibition. And I have to thank my colleague Rob Shelley, our photographer, who took all these beautiful installation shots of the show. So although the book and exhibition share the same title, the book is a companion volume 2, not a catalog of the exhibition. There is, of course, overlap, but also differences between the show and the book. And I think the overarching aquatint project is better and stronger for these complementary approaches. Part of this evolution, part of this was the evolution of my thinking about the subject over time. Began working on the show again in 2018. I wrote most of the manuscript in the fall of 2020. We had a very tight timeline. And then the opening of the exhibition was delayed by a year until the fall of 2021. So it was a really wonderful opportunity with the exhibition to continue thinking about the subject of 18th century aquatints and, of course, continue making acquisitions. Various logistics, including space limitations, also accounted for differences between the book and the show. In the book, of course, we could illustrate works that couldn't be loaned. And one of the Aquatint pioneers, whose work I desperately wish we could have included in the show, was the Irish artist James Barry. And here I'm showing you his 1776 King Lear and Cordelia, Act 5, Scene 10, an etching and aquatint touched with India ink at the Yale Center for British Art, complete with the related Shakespeare quote below that ends, "She's gone forever." Now, picked out 4 vertical slices for details from landscape-related works in the show: Saint-Non, Sandby, Prestel, Fisher, that we'll be looking at through this talk. Generally speaking, the works in the book and the show span from the 1760s into the 1830s. We wanted to tip into the early 19th century, though with a concentration on the first 4 decades of the medium's international flourishing in Europe. So why this focus? Although acknowledging that aquatint was invented in the 1650s in the Netherlands, as David mentioned, and here I point you to Ed Steinman's research, its possibilities lay dormant until the 18th century, when there was a burgeoning interest in studying and collecting reproductions of drawings. By supplementing etching's line work with means to subtly render tone, aquatint, in the first period of its genuine blossoming, offered a new and exciting method to replicate the gestural brushstrokes of ink and wash drawings, and especially when these works were printed in brown inks. It was an exciting time to see how artists are exploring this new tonal medium. So I'd like to say there was nothing to unlearn. And I continue to be amazed by the beauty, the complexity, and the sheer variety of these works, which range broadly, I think you can even see here, in terms of project or print genre, subject matter, style, and technique. Francisco Goya obviously will be the name that is familiar to most people, but I didn't want this project to be, the book or the exhibition to be a Goya and predecessors project. I wanted to really expand and complicate the 18th century history of the medium. I also thought it was important to draw attention to the work of many aquatint pioneers that are undeservedly lesser known, because impressions of these early aquatints are rare today. They weren't produced in large numbers, in part because the finely textured surfaces of the plates wore down quickly in repeated runs through the press. Also, because many of the aquatint pioneers only worked in the medium for a short time before moving on to other projects. What amazes me is that by the 1770s and 1780s, there are several artists creating aquatints across Europe. And this international spread and experimentation with this innovative medium happened before the availability of step-by-step treatises on the technique in the 1790s. So how did this early knowledge of aquatint come about? Now, of course, there's the circulation of prints. Impressions could be purchased directly from the printmaker or from a print seller. They could also be obtained and shipped via an international network of art agents that included artists, publishers, art dealers, and booksellers. And of course, aquatint shared the advantages of other prints: small scale, lightweight, and portable multiples that could easily be packed and transported. Equally important to the networks of the international print market was the treasure trove of information in periodicals. And first and foremost were French journals, which were read throughout Europe. Please remember that French is the cosmopolitan language of the 18th century. And these journals provided a platform for artists to pitch their new prints and projects. But printmakers were not the only ones announcing their new creations. Discriminating journal editors also conveyed information on newly released prints. A case in point being the Neue Bibliothek, edited by Christian Felix Weisse and published in Leipzig. Information in these journals ensured that cosmopolitan collectors would be au courant and conversant in the latest artistic developments. Now we're going to take a quick virtual tour of the show, which was held in the West Building of the National Gallery, on the ground floor in what are called the inner tier galleries. It's sort of a C or U-shaped suite of 5 galleries. In the exhibition in all, there were 111 works. There were prints, They were drawings, so we wanted to show some ink and wash drawings next to the Aquatints. There were print albums, and there were illustrated books. All in all, about 2/3 of the objects were new acquisitions, and about 3/4 of the works had never been exhibited before at the National Gallery. Aquatint, from its origins to Goya, was conceived as a permanent collection project, but we had 3 loans from the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles and the Blanton Museum of Art at the University of Texas in Austin, for which I remain most grateful. The show was organized in a loose chronological order in monographic or thematic sections. And one thing that was really important for me in terms of thinking about Aquatint as this cross-cultural cosmopolitan phenomenon is I wanted to make sure that each of the 5 galleries included works made by artists from different countries. So gallery 1 sort of have 2 sides. This is after you come through the entrance. And I wanted on the right, we have the beginnings of Aquatint in Paris in the 1760s here, but on the right, I wanted to provide a context for this 18th century development of Aquatint. Thinking about how in 18th century Europe, the creation, distribution, collecting, teaching, and study of printed reproductions of the old master and what were then contemporary drawings, or as David said, cutting edge contemporary, I love that, drawings allowed an educated, wealthy, and cosmopolitan audience to strengthen their knowledge of art history as an intellectual pursuit and as a social pastime. The growing interest in and market for these printed reproductions of drawings not only prompted 18th century artists and publishers to gear up production, but it also spurred innovation and international competition among enterprising printmakers and print publishers who gained access to drawings in private collections through their art world connections. Several techniques were available to printmakers for replicating highly prized drawings. And the possibilities of all of these techniques, be they applied individually or in combination, were expanded through the use of different colors of ink and papers, as well as hand coloring. All right, and I should add that all of the works that I am showing you today are from the National Gallery's collections, unless specified otherwise. Some printmakers relied upon existing techniques to reproduce drawings using, for example, etching, chiaroscuro woodcut, mezzotint, sulfur tint, and stipple. And here, just 2 works from the show. I have Anton Maria Zanetti, Muccis D'Avola, putting his hand in the fire from the 1720s, a chiaroscuro woodcut printed from 3 blocks. And here is William Ryland's Jacob, persuaded to send Benjamin with his brethren into Egypt from 1762. And this is actually a stipple and roulette print after a brush and wash drawing by Anthony Van Dyck. Other printmakers developed new printmaking techniques. Between the late 1750s and the early 1770s, France witnessed the invention of the chalk manner, pastel manner, and wash manner prints. These technical innovations entailed the expert manipulation of custom-made tools to make fine clusters of marks in their copper plates, marks that mimicked strokes of chalk or pastel on laid paper. The exacting mechanical work was labor-intensive and time-consuming, but it gave the printmaker greater control over the final results. And at right, we have 2 prints. This is a chalk manner print by Louis Mahin Bonnet after a drawing by Carl van Loo of his daughter, Rosalie, from 1764. And this is printed from 2 plates, one inked in black, one inked in white, printed in registration on a sheet of blue paper. And at right, we have Jean-François Janinet's wash manner print from 1776, Colonnade and Gardens of the Medici Palace. And wash manner, just to clarify, although it has similarly tonal effects, is distinct from Aquatint in that that tone is created mechanically with special tools in the plate. And in the case of Janinet's work, which is after a painting by Hubert Robert, this is printed from 4 plates, inked in red, yellow, blue, and black ink, printed in registration on a sheet of white paper. The surge of competitive advertisements for these prints in journals of the time underscores the market potential for such works. Artists competitively claimed to be the first and the best in these new forms. The atmosphere of excitement and intrigue around these printmaking innovations, and even outright secrecy about them, aligned with the intensive Enlightenment preoccupation with discoveries and advances in knowledge. The creation, distribution, and collecting of these prints in 18th century Europe laid the groundwork for the development of Aquatint in the 1760s. All right, this is François-Philippe Charpentier's etching and Aquatint, 1762, after a wash drawing by Carl van Loo. It's now in a private collection. So in 1762, again, that wall on the left, talking about the development of Aquatint in Paris in the 1760s. In 1762, two professional printmakers, the Frenchman François-Philippe Charpentier and the Swede Per Christoph Floding, placed an advertisement in a Paris journal to promote 6 works made in, quote, a new manner of printmaking in perfect imitation of wash, unquote, what we know of today as Aquatint. And it's interesting, Charpentier and Floding actually discovered the technique independently of one another, but upon discovering what each was up to, decided to join forces in what was ultimately to be a very short collaboration. Now, Charpentier and Floding were both professional printmakers, highly skilled technicians who specialized in reproducing the works of other artists, using Aquatint to multiply famous old master and contemporary drawings to carve out a niche in the vast and increasingly diverse international print market. Perseus and Andromeda, after Carl van Loo, was then in the collection of Ange Lalive de Julie, one of the era's most prominent art collectors. And this was one of the prints that Charpentier advertised in 1762. Charpentier dedicated this large-scale print, this is beautiful engraved lettering below, to the Marquis de Marigny, head of the Royal Arts Administration and brother to Madame de Pompadour, official mistress to King Louis XV. In this work, Charpentier closely and fluently followed van Loo's drawing in orientation, size, and composition. It's truly, and this is a large scale print, it's truly a tour de force bravura display of this new technique. Close inspection, and I'm showing you a detail of the water at lower right. Close inspection of the print, however, reveals that Charpentier went back into the plate with a roulette to mechanically supplement the aquatinted tone in select passages. And here I'm showing you, I think you can see these marks here to augment the tone. Objects like Charpentier's Perseus and Andromeda were both appreciated as sophisticated facsimiles and as wondrous objects in their own right. The advertisement also encouraged customers to snap up one of a limited number of impressions. And again, as we talked about earlier, although these early aquatints were not printed in large numbers, I love how Charpentier and Floding basically used this drawback to make the prints more desirable and emphasize their limited availability. So Charpentier, we'll come back to him, but he's a very important figure who worked intensely with Aquatint in the mid-1760s on a wide range of projects to really build interest in the new medium. Floding went back to Stockholm early on. So Charpentier is really, although very little known today, is a key figure in building this interest in the medium in the 1760s. And then he moved on. He refashioned himself as an inventor, and later advertisements include products such as an air pump, a mechanical easel, and my favorite, a tooth extractor. So moving on to the second gallery of the exhibition, which you can see 2 walls of with this great wide-angled lens. And again, wanting to keep that international impact in each of the galleries, we have works from France on this wall, works from England on this wall, and then wonderful large-scale case of books. In this case, there are 3 albums. This is important to keep in mind, and wanted to convey this to our audiences, is that some of these works may have been glazed and framed and hung on walls, but many of these early aquatints were kept in portfolios or arranged in albums for easier handling, consultation, and storage, and especially the prints made in series. And I love in the installation, you really have a sense of each of these books as a distinct character unto itself. When I mentioned earlier, there were issues with space limitations. This was one of the challenges, was I could have easily put 10 more books and print albums into the show if we had space, but this looks beautiful. In 1768, a new player entered the Aquatint arena in Paris, namely Jean-Baptiste Le Prince. Le Prince was a peintre graveur, a painter printmaker, that is a versatile artist who explored Aquatint as a means to revisit, recreate, and circulate his own designs, build his reputation, and generate extra income. Le Prince acknowledged that he did not invent the technique of Aquatint, but he proudly took credit for perfecting it. And he literally says this in one of his advertisements. Le Prince specialized in Russian themes inspired by his 5-year sojourn in the country, catering to a widespread fascination with Russia throughout Europe at the time. This interest was fueled in part by ongoing discussions about Russia's modernization or westernization over the course of the 18th century. Printmaking also enabled Le Prince to target a broader public interested in Russian imagery, first with etchings and then beginning in 1768 with aquatints. Le Prince actively promoted his exquisite aquatints to a broad audience through savvily worded journal advertisements and impressive displays in the prestigious state-sponsored public art exhibition known as the Paris Salon. In the Salon of 1769, for example, he showed no less than 29 aquatints. He also protected the secrets of his specific technique, which generated considerable intrigue. And here I'm showing you a beautiful impression from 1771, The Fisherman, an etching in aquatin by Le Prince, printed in brown ink. Le Prince's aquatints are distinguished not only by their subtle range of translucent and seemingly speckle-free tonal gradations, but also by the special process he used to create the works on his copper plates, much as he made drawings with brush and wash in all of their details. Le Prince's fine-tuned approach set the bar for European aquatint pioneers. As I like to say, he's the first aquatint celebrity or superstar. Now we turn to Paul Sandby. In 1775, when the English artist Paul Sandby wrote to a friend, he said, quote, "I perceive you have been trying at Le Prince's secret. I got a key to it and am perfect master of it. The work is so delightful and easy to me now. In the execution, I do it with the same ease, but with more pleasure than on paper," end quote. And indeed, it is Sandby who is credited with coining the name of this new medium with the title of his 1775 series, 12 Views in Aquatinta from Drawings Taken on the Spot in South Wales. And here I am showing you a scene from his second series, 12 Views in North Wales, a nighttime view of Carnarvon Castle, an atmospheric composition that dazzles and delights the eye. The glow of the moon above reverberates in the clouds, reflected in the rippling water below. We see fires blazing on either side of the castle. And upper right, my favorite detail, we see a firework rendered through the masterful application of stop out shooting up into the air. Sandby advanced aquatint technically and thematically by pairing it with his close observation of nature. He was adept at using small figures to animate and lend scale to his compositions, details that encourage viewers to engage with the prints. And Sandby thoughtfully ordered the series, like these Welsh views, to visually transport the viewer from one scene to the next, the sequence itself unfolding like a trip. With the growing audience of admirers in British landscape art in England and abroad, Sandby provided the foundation for Aquatint's subsequent development and advancement in England. All right, now we are moving to the third gallery, and I'm showing you a section of aquatints by different amateurs. So we've already mentioned two categories of artists who played distinctive roles in publicizing, spreading, and advancing the medium of aquatint. Professional printmakers like Charpentier, painter printmakers like Le Prince and Sandby, again, who are making aquatints of their own designs. The third group, what was known in the 18th century as amateurs, an elite group of like-minded worldly collectors. They were tastemakers of their day, a bit like modern day influencers, though their social networks were of course smaller. Amateurs embraced drawing, etching, and sometimes aquatint to enhance their connoisseurship, cultivate relationships with artists, and serve as inspiration for their own projects. These affluent individuals did not need to make prints to sustain their livelihood, but understandably took pride in their creations. In corresponding with and circulating their prints among other amateurs and people of cultural distinction, this international coterie facilitated the European transmission of aquatint. Between 1765 and 1786, the Dutch timber merchant Cornelis van Amstel, and you see 4 of his prints with aquatint on the wall here, used a combination of different printmaking techniques, including aquatint, to replicate drawings, Dutch drawings for the most part, in Dutch private collections, including his own. He referred to these 46 works as printed drawings. But I am going to focus here on Jean-Claude Richard de Abbé de Saint-Non, who was an ordained but non-practicing priest. We actually included Saint-Non's work in the first gallery to talk about the flourishing of aquatint in Paris in the 1760s. And the reason he was there was because Charpentier, who we talked about, one of Charpentier's other important contributions to the development of aquatint was teaching, giving demonstrations of this new technique to multiple amateurs, Saint-Non being one of them. Charpentier was Saint-Non's teacher, and Saint-Non took to aquatint like a duck to water. He would go on to create more than 250 aquatints, primarily after drawings by contemporary French artists he engaged with and passionately supported, especially Jean-Honoré Fragonard, but also Hubert Robert. And the aquatint I'm showing you here is the entrance of the temple of Serapis at Pozzuoli from 1767. After Robert, the etching and aquatinting of drawings enabled amateurs like Saint-Non to closely study their sources, analyzing, identifying, and articulating the elements and essence of an artist's style was the ultimate exercise in connoisseurship. So with Saint-Non sort of further complicating the matter of how his aquatints correspond to and deviate from his sources. And in this case, we know that this composition relates to 2 related red chalk drawings, is this sophisticated and yet playfully interpretive approach that Saint-Non brought to revisiting his sources in graphic form. Sometimes he simplified, changed, and omitted details to distinguish or put his own stamp on his creations when he rendered these designs in aquatints. And although this composition, the very basic parts of the design are underpinned with etching, which will be done in the plate first before the aquatint. This work, like many of Saint-Non's gorgeous aquatints, was realized almost in pure tone, exemplified by the clouds that we see up here. And I love how Saint-Non is using that distinctive speckle of aquatint to evoke the worn, eroded surfaces of stone architecture, the dappled sunlight and shadow, the voluminous clouds. And this is a work, Saint-Non always credited his sources. So we have Robert's name down here and his name down here. But one playful thing, there's an old stone plaque on the wall, and under SPQR, he put Robert's name. And then there's a humble little rock down here where Saint-Non put his own name. And this really encouraged close looking and engagement with the prints. Saint-Non and Ploss van Amstel, who I should say, part of the reason we can track the circulation of their prints, their prints come up the most in late 18th century inventories and auction catalogs. It's very interesting to see. They not only gifted their prints, again, to people of cultural distinction. We know that Saint-Non, for example, gave impressions of his prints to the philosophe Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We also know that Ploss van Amstel and Saint-Non gave demonstrations of the technique. And most famously in 1778, Saint-Non gave a demonstration of aquatint to the American diplomat and inventor, Benjamin Franklin, the very same year that France agreed to support the colonies in the War of Independence. All right. Moving to the third gallery of the exhibition, again, you can see our Aquatint case, and this is where we are talking about the Prestels. Aquatint arrived in Germany in the 1770s, but it was the couple Johann Gottlieb Prestel and Maria Katharina Prestel, who worked first in Nuremberg and then in Frankfurt, who established international recognition for their work in this new medium. Between 1776 and 1785, Maria Katharina and Johann created more than 100 reproductions of the Old Master drawings that were then held in German collections. They expertly used a customized combination of intaglio printmaking techniques, including Aquatint, to translate the drawings at hand to scale, often printing these facsimiles from multiple plates inked in different colors. And the National Gallery is fortunate to have the Prestel's third series in its entirety in the Rosenwald collection. All of these prints along this wall are from that portfolio. This third series was formerly titled in French, here translated, Drawings by the Best Painters of Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands, taken from various famous cabinets, unquote. But it is now usually referred to as the Kleine Cabinet. The majority of the 36 prints in this series were made by Maria Katharina Prestel and Regina Schoenecker, a student in the Prestel studio. So really love that this gallery and the exhibition provided a welcome opportunity to highlight the work of both of these women artists. The single most famous print in the Kleine Cabinet was Maria Katharina Prestel's etching in Aquatint, The Triumph of Truth Over Envy, which is on the right, after a glorious drawing by the 16th century Italian artist Jacopo Ligozzi, now in the collection of the Albertina in Vienna. You can see here on the left. I think you can see looking at this was a challenging print to create, not only in terms of the allegorical subject matter, but also the technique of the drawing itself. The drawing is brown wash heightened with gold. It also is, I don't know if you can see this, lightly squared for transfer with white chalk. So I like to imagine how Maria Katharina Prestel went about reverse engineering the image, how to make it into a print. And she did this, you know, we talk about facsimiles, reproductions, but in many ways, these prints are best thought of as translations or interpretations. And when we look at Maria Katharina's print on the right, we see that she decided to leave out that grid, and she really amplified the use of gold, making it a beautiful object. Maria Katharina Prestel's tour de force etching in Aquatint was printed from 2 plates, one etched and aquatinted and printed in brown ink, and then the same sheet of paper went through the press with another second plate etched and printed in ochre ink. And while the lines of the ochre ink were still wet, she finally powdered gold leaf, dusted it over those wet lines. All right, as extraordinary as the Prestel's productions were, and nothing of being complicated, time consuming, they were not profitable enough to support the couple and their 4 children. By 1786, they were bankrupt. Maria Katharina Prestel left her husband and moved abroad to reinvent her career in London, where Aquatint specialists were increasingly appreciated and in demand. And in the summer of 2021, just a few months before the exhibition opened, we were able to acquire this impression of Maria Katharina Prestel's 1791 etching in Aquatint, View of the Loss of the Rhone, after Louis Bélanger, in which she marshaled the dappled application of stop out with the speckled pattern of rosin and multiple bitings of the plate to evoke the tactility of Bélanger's brushwork of what was most likely an opaque watercolor. Okay, now we're in gallery 4. With this gallery, we decided not to have any section texts, and the broad theme was Aquatints made in or inspired by Italy. Each of the 4 walls shows a different series of prints, Depré, Depian. Again, remembering that many of these prints, again, these early Aquatints were made as series. This was also the one gallery in terms of technology. There was a monitor that enabled us to present a slideshow of 15 illustrations from the first 4 volumes from Jean Houel's spectacular picturesque journey on the islands of Sicily, Malta, and Lipari. which is in the case here, including several of his unforgettable images of volcanoes. And then adjacent in the case is Johann Karl Richter's Aquatint of a volcano in its original mount after an engraving by Heinrich Gutenberg after a painting by Pierre-Jacques Vollert. And we have a blow-up detail here on the wall, and that was also the poster child for the exhibition. Now, along here, you can see most of the series by Giovanni Depian after Francesco Galimberti of the notorious and inhumane prison system known as the Leads and the Wells of Venice. This series of etching and aquatints was commissioned in 1797 by the Provisional Venetian government. And the work I'm showing you here is the third plate with the title, The Well for Violators of State Law. Each of the prints of prisons in this series included a bar scale that showed you the small claustrophobic dimensions of these spaces. What's extraordinary is how Depian used the darkness of Aquatint to just convey the sense of the claustrophobic, the restrictive space, limited movement, despair, and just this sense of diminished existence being in these horrific prisons. And I have to say, this series was really interesting to have in the show. I was not familiar with it until I went to work at the National Gallery, and it was one of the most commented upon series in the exhibition. In addition to prisons and volcanoes, we also had in the fourth gallery 3 works by the French artist Louis-Jean Desprez that were related to his untitled series of mysterious tombs made in the early 1780s when he was a pensionnaire at the French Academy in Rome. And I'm showing you one of our relatively new acquisitions. This is really like a puzzle piece snapping into place. A previously unrecorded proof of the etched state of the composition. It's called Tomb with Death Standing, to which the artist has added black wash. And we showed this in the exhibition. You can see here with 2 aquatints that we borrowed from the Getty